Hello and good morning friends, welcome to the CEC EduSet live lecture. Dear friends, with our ongoing series on women and history, today again we would be discussing in detail on women education and writing in colonial India. In the previous two sessions also we discussed the topic in detail, and we would like to cover the remaining portion which we have left. And for this discussion we have once again with us in our studios Dr. Shruti Vip. Dr. Shruti Vip is Assistant Professor in PG DAV Evening College. She is in the Department of History. So let's welcome our guest Dr. Shruti Vip, and let's try to grab maximum knowledge through her. Hello ma'am, welcome to the EduSet lecture.
Thanks a lot for giving me the opportunity to speak on the subject. Hello friends, we would be continuing from where I left in the last lecture. That is, we were discussing the important role played by education and women writings during the colonial period. I have already discussed with you briefly the important aspect of journals and magazines as part of women writings, and today I would be discussing autobiographies and biographies and how these new kind of writings that started appearing during 19th century continued to influence the minds of various women who were able to read and write these autobiographies. The feminist writings in the early 19th century were largely an account of the personal lives of women, and the beginnings were made basically in Bengal, and also some Marathi women were also able to read and write and make note of their own life journey. These autobiographies were largely confessions, the stories of the struggle of these women that they encountered in their homes, and this was also important in the sense that for the first time women thought it worthwhile to write about themselves. So they were not writing about the nation or the society or the social reform movement, but the subject matter was their own life, so they thought it worthwhile to talk about themselves, and the readers also thought it worthwhile to spend their time and energy on reading the accounts of these women. So historians say that we can consider these early autobiographies being written in the 19th century as part of early feminist writings, because they gave women an opportunity to talk about themselves, both objectively as well as subjectively. And as has been pointed out by Himani Banerjee in 1991, the print media gave an opportunity to bridge the divide between the public and the private sphere. Giving some examples of various autobiographies that were produced during 19th century, one can talk about Rassundari Devi, who was writing in 1810, then Binodini Dasi from 1863 to 1941 was her lifespan, and she also wrote a lot. Then we have Kashibai Kanitkar from 1861 to 1948, Ramabai Ranade 1862 to 1924, and Lakshmibai Tilak 1868 to 1936. So these are some of the women who, after gaining access to literacy, education, some formal training, also spent some time of their life in writing, and they were not writing about any particular academic discipline. They were writing about themselves, what they were going through, and so it definitely produced a very interesting genre of literature. Works of Sirat Kumari Chaudharani from 1861 to 1920, who was writing in Bengali, then Krupa Satina Nandan, who was writing in English, Ramabai Ranade writing in Marathi, and Binodini Dasi writing in Bengali. All these were records of the lives of Indian women. Bama Bodhini and Bharati, these were the earliest Bengali magazines that were edited by Swarna Kumari Devi, and they held, interestingly, some essay competitions for women, thereby giving scope to educated women, to literate women to vent out their feelings and also to share their experiences with the larger world. Rassundari Devi was born in 1810 and she wrote the first autobiography, Amar Jeevan, which means my life, which was published in Bengali in 1876, and its second part was published in 1906. Now, this is a very interesting account as it reveals her struggle and her query with which she frequently posed to the society and to her family as to why her womanhood had made her efforts to read and write such a challenge. So she did not like the idea that simply because she was a woman, she had to face so many hurdles and she had to prove herself time and again, or she had to hide in some corner of her house to simply undertake the process of reading or writing. So it was why it was so for a woman in India was her constant question. She lamented the fact that women were completely under the control of men in a society that considered education of women to be a taboo. So she had started questioning, and all those women who were reading, who were going to read her writings, also would be developing that question in their mind. Then we have some very interesting readings also of Savitribai Phule from 1831 to 1897, who was wife of Jyotiba Phule. She was a Dalit social activist who keenly followed her husband's work, who himself was a great social reformer, a writer, and she was also the first woman teacher and an educationist. She wrote in Marathi about the difficulties that she had to face as part of her revolutionary ideology towards upliftment of women, and again she spoke time and again of various difficulties that women of particularly lower castes encountered in their journey towards achieving literacy and education. Some of her poems, for example, Kavya Phule that came out in 1854 and Bavan Kashi Subodhrantar in 1892, they are biography in verse of her husband, and she had great zeal of not only talking about and writing about education, but also of liberating women, and many of her letters show that spirit, and they are definitely a source of inspiration for not only contemporary women but also Dalit women and Dalit writings. They mark a very important phase in Dalit literature. In similar genre, one can talk about Muktabai, who was writing around after 1850s, and she herself was an untouchable and a student of Savitribai's school. Her essay that was published in 1855 in a journal, it attacked Brahmins and openly attacked untouchability, and the essay was path-breaking in various ways and can be considered as an important milestone in feminist writing. Then we also have a series of writings that were developed by Moksho Dayani Mukhopadhyay, 1848, who was the sister of W.C. Banerjee. She was the first, who was the first president of Indian National Congress. Besides being sister of W.C. Banerjee, the first president of Indian National Congress, she was a woman in her own right, and she is known for a critique that she developed to discuss as to how it was men who needed reforms and not women, because there were so many problems that were there with the psyche of men that needed to be challenged, that needed to be questioned, and it was men who needed reform movement and not women. Then she wrote some interesting novels like Safal Swapna in the 1884 and a collection of poem Bana Prasoon, which was published in a literary journal, Banga Darshan, which was edited by Bankim Chandra Chatterjee. Then another very important newsletter that was published by her was Banga Mahila, which published regularly her many articles. Now, all her writings were path-breaking in the sense that she was not only addressing Bengali women, but Indian women and even women belonging to the world, and she was questioning questioning the very mindset of men who thought that it was only Indian women who needed a series of socio-religious reform movements to bring them out of oblivion. Then another very important woman writer that one can talk of, and also a social reformer, was Tarabai Shinde, active from 1870s to 1910. In 1882, she wrote an article, Istri Purush Tulna, that is a comparison of men and women, which was published in Satsar, a journal that was published by Satya Shodhak Mondal, which was keenly pursuing the cause of reform movements in Western India. She was not only a feminist thinker and a critique, but also she was quite well versed in a number of languages like Sanskrit, Marathi, English, and also was well versed in both classical as well as modern literature. So even almost 80 to 90 years before, when Simone de Beauvoir would be writing The Second Sex in 1949, we have an Indian woman who penned a number of writings which were questioning, which were path-breaking, and which can definitely be considered as part of feminist literature. And all this was happening within a very closed and within a colonial society that was India. So that is the very beauty of and the great achievement of the various writings that started appearing one after another in course of 19th century. Now this Istri Purush Tulna was almost a 40-page long essay. And in this, Tarabai openly depicted the male stereotypes and the images of women in response to an article that had emerged in another magazine, that is Pune Vaibhav. Now, this article criticized Vijay Lakshmi, who had been sentenced to death for either having an abortion or due to committing infanticide because she did not want the unborn child. So she definitely took a stand of to side with Vijay Lakshmi, and she thought that it was very much within the right and privilege of Vijay Lakshmi to decide for herself what she wanted and not what the society deemed fit for her. Tarabai Shinde criticized male hypocrisy, saying that men themselves are full of vices which they accuse women of, and they are themselves responsible for these various vices which are ultimately thrust upon women, and they are considered as part of the conspiracy, whereas it is not true. She said that even if a woman is guilty of committing heinous crimes, still she cannot be blamed for spoiling anyone's life, which most of the time men end up doing in order to satisfy their own greed and lust. So she thought that women, by virtue of their morality, intellect and values, was much superior to man, and it only depended on the society to realize how much evil men have been creating, and in the name of reform movements that cannot be washed away. So such words by an Indian woman in 19th century were definitely unparalleled and path-breaking. Then another very interesting series of writings were developed by Pandita Ramabai Saraswati, whose time span extends from 1858 to 1922. She was an initiator of the movement of women's liberation in India, herself born in a family that encouraged fight against social injustice. Her father Anant Shastri was a great Sanskrit scholar who narrated Bhagavat and Puranas, but he also trained women folk of his family, his wife as well as the daughters in these narratives, and this was a great achievement as far as those times were concerned. So in her autobiography, that is My Testimony, which came out in 1907, as well as a number of articles that she wrote in newspapers, all these writings established her as a legendary woman, and in fact her writings were so popular and they also carried a price tag, and they were even able to financially support her. So you can well imagine the value addition that these early women writers were making to the field of literature. In her writing Stri Dharm Niti in 1882, then High Caste Hindu Women in 1888, and in My Testimony 1889. In these major works, she questioned the given values that had been devised by Indian society and also raised important questions as to why they are continuously being followed, and the reason she devised was illiteracy. Then, since she had been trained by her father in Indian literature, in Indian philosophy, and also how to recite various shastras, so she started her recital as early at the age of 11 or 12 years, especially after the demise of her father. She delivered Harikatha at the age of 11 after her parents died in a famine. So this truly inspired a number of scholars, social workers, government officials, and even European officers. They witnessed her speeches, discourses, and they were frequently reported in a number of newspapers. So she soon became very popular, and she was bestowed the title of Pandita and Saraswati by Professor Tone and by Nyaya Ratna. And soon she became popular not only in India but also abroad. In 1882, another great path-working work that was done by Pandita Ramabai was that she demanded women's education before the Hunter Commission and emphasized the need particularly for medical education of women. Now this again was very inspirational because Hunter delivered a speech on Ramabai and her work in England, and this also impressed Queen Victoria, and as a result of this initiative, Queen Victoria established medical dispensaries for women, which were definitely going to benefit Indian women in the long run. Ramabai learnt English and visited London, and she soon adopted Christianity as she had a lot of problems with Hindu religion because of her unorthodox ideas and ways. But here also she did not adopt Christianity per se without questioning various legalities she had in mind, and from time to time she would continue posing her doubts and she would continue raising questions even as far as Christian thought and belief was concerned. She was also quite vocal about her differences with Christian priests. So here was a woman who was not going to accept anything as it came and had questions and doubts and was not hesitant to raise them even on a foreign land. Then Ramabai is not only known for her writings, but also she is recognized for raising and for carrying forward the cause of women. One of her great achievements was the establishment of Sharda Sadan, a house for Hindu widows and destitute women. And in one of her letters that she wrote to Bombay Guardian, she said that it is very shameful that Indian women are exposed to male doctors. So how can Westerners think that Indian women have no dignity? So why not facilitate lady women practitioners for Indian women patients? And this point was well taken care of, and some initiatives were also started in this regard. Then in the High Caste Hindu Woman that she had written, she criticized the lawmakers of Hindus and also the prevalent customs for being so brutal towards Indian women. She said that the idea of a happy life was imaginary, as women have never experienced freedom, neither in their homes before marriage nor after marriage. So the very notion of their being happy needs to be questioned and needs to be seriously discussed and deciphered in greater detail. Then another great woman writer was Kashibai Kanitkar from 1861 to 1948. Her very important autobiography and two novels which definitely point to some path-breaking work was Ranga Rao in 1903 and Pal Kichagond, The Silk Tassel in the Palanquin in 1928, in addition to a number of short stories and reviews that she got published time and again. Now, in her autobiography, Kanitkar writes that women have accepted the domination of men because they have considered themselves as weak and low. So, it is partly women who are to be blamed for their state, for the condition in which they are. And in her novels, she portrays women as confused beings with divided sensibilities who need to be more clear in their thought and actions. Then another great writer, educationist and jurist about whom we must talk about was Cornelia Sorabji from 1866 to 1954. She was not only a writer, a social activist, but also well versed in a number of languages like Marathi, Gujarati, English, Persian, Urdu, Bengali, and she wrote on a wide variety of subjects like law, politics, women, which were published in a series of British journals also. She herself had studied at Oxford, and she helped the wives of royalty, the wives of the widows of aristocrats whose lands had been taken away by the Britishers, especially after Dalhousie's doctrine of lapse, and she helped these aristocratic widows to fight their cases and to win back their property. Her first published work was Love and Life Behind Parda, which came out in 1901. Then she wrote a series of short stories, almost 11 in number, which were based primarily on her career in law and based on her legal career, on the legal fights that she had picked up on behalf of these aristocratic women. Then she wrote stories of almost 13 women and how their tussle between tradition and modernity was bringing about positive results in Indian society, and they were also able to win back their lost property. Cornelia championed the cause of widows of the royal family, especially since these widows were not able to present themselves openly in the court of law due to parda. So she repeatedly talked about how these parda nasheens were gradually losing their rights, their property, and whatever rightly belonged to them simply because of the regressive practice of parda and how important it was to get rid of practice so that these women and their families would get back their lost rights and properties. In India Calling, she discussed how the seclusion of women had prevented important evidence from reaching the court, and how someone else would be speaking on behalf of these women as they were not allowed to testify in public, and how this ultimately resulted in losing the cases in many instances. Then a series of evidences were also taken in their homes by the commission judge, and again she pointed out that how it was someone else only who was repeatedly speaking on behalf of these women, and these women did not even know what was being stated on behalf of them in the courts. So the entire parda system was robbing these women of well-earned estates which rightfully belonged to them. Then Cornelia Sorabji's number of works unfolded to the world the reality of the court proceedings and also are a window to the colonial law court proceedings. Then another very important woman one must talk of is Begum Rokeya from 1880 to 1932. She was born in an orthodox Muslim family which keenly observed Parda and women could only read Holy Quran. She was married at an age of 16 years to Sayyid Sakhawat Hussain, who was himself a liberal Muslim and he wanted to promote schooling among girls, Muslim girls. But since he died, the work was carried on further by his widow Begum Rokeya, and this school continues to hold ground even today. In literature, Begum Rokeya wrote a series of books which she composed in Bengali, like Moti Chur Volume 1 that came out in 1904 and Volume 2 in 1922. But the most important work that she is known for is Sultana's Dream, which was written in English. It was a fantasy and it came out in 1908. In Sultana's Dream, the work on Sultana's Dream had started in 1905, but it took almost 3 years to mature. And this is a female utopian fantasy in which she talks about, Begum Rokeya talks about a dream world in which men have hardly any role to play, as most of the important activities, jobs, works are done by women themselves. And men are confined to a quarter in the house. There is a men's quarter. So just like there used to be a female quarter, here Begum Rokeya was talking about a men's quarter, and men would only be living inside that quarter and they would not be taking any interest in the affairs of the state. It was the women who had taken the leash from the men. So war, crime and all sorts of evils were completely absent from this kind of society, which she described as ladyland. And in this new emerging ladyland that she visualized, all the productive activities were being undertaken by women. Now, some interesting excerpts from her novel read as follows. Our good queen liked science very much. She circulated an order that all women in her country should be educated, and early marriage also was stopped. No woman was allowed to marry before she was 21. So in this ladyland, which was going to be a dream, a utopia that she projected, 21 was going to be the age of marriage and not even 18. And because she thought that it was very important for women to gain access to education and particularly scientific education, and only then they could become successful human beings also much more earlier than being wives or mothers or daughters. So Rokeya, through this fantasy, tries to show that the ability of women has been undermined so far because they have been deprived of education, they have been forced into early marriage, and even if given a chance, they can also experiment with science. So for example, she even talked about cooking with solar energy in her novel. Now, focusing on Rokeya's writings, another very interesting statement that she made in one of her writings was that as sunlight does not enter our bedrooms, so also the light of knowledge does not penetrate our minds. So she was silently questioning that why Muslim women were being deprived of exposure to the public world and how this deprivation was being very dear to them. They were not being able to explore so many things that existed in the wider world. Now, it was not as if Rokeya was only criticizing. She also had some positive initiatives that she was talking about in her works. So, for example, she talked about that how both the work, sexes, men and women, need to work in synergy. And it is not as if one leg of a person can do all the work. So, both the legs have to work together, have to take a step together in order to achieve what was unachievable. And a very interesting piece of writing was novel Padmarag that appeared in 1924. This was again a female utopia in which she talked about women, marriage and household as not being the ultimate goals of marriage. The ultimate goal of a woman was to gain self-respect. Thanks a lot. Coming to the last part of our lecture, that is nationalism and feminist writings. So in this we would be discussing that how the national movement, which was in its full swing during the first half of 20th century, the first 2 decades of 20th century, how this coincided with the feminist writings. So the feminist writings before independence were definitely influenced by the social and political movements started by Mahatma Gandhi and a number of other nationalist leaders. The freedom movement, then the Antyodaya, the upliftment of Dalits and untouchables, and the upliftment of women in particular were important movements that were working hand in hand on parallel basis. According to Veer Bharat Talwar in 1999, Hindi provinces around the First World War saw the emergence of women's organizations and groups and the publication of a series of women's magazines by women journalists, and the progress had already been there even during the course of 19th century. The change now was, the extent was much more, the numbers of these publications were much more. So one can talk of Subhadra Kumari Chauhan, 1904 to 1948. She was not only a great Hindi literature but also a social worker. Her poem Jhansi Ki Rani not only talks about patriotism but also indicates women empowerment. Her most famous book, Mukul, that is Flower, was published in 1930, and Bikhre Moti in 1932. This was followed by a series of short stories like Unmadini that came out in 1934. Seedhe Saadhe Chitra, which was published after her death. Now, most of these writings that we can talk about that have been ascribed to Subhadra Kumari Chauhan not only talk about patriotism but also women empowerment. She herself was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi and was the first woman satyagrahi from UP who went to jail several times. So this partly explains how most of her work have a fervor of patriotism, and subjects of her writing besides patriotism were early marriage, widows, socio-economic dependence of women in the private and public sphere. Then in addition to that, we have a series of female nationalist writers who were writing on various socio-political and cultural issues from mid-20th centuries onwards. So, for example, one can talk of Darsi Annapurna 1907 to 1931, who wrote on issues that were raised by the socio-religious reform movements and also the humorous situation of women due to their superstitions. So, the idea of superstition came to be keenly observed by these feminist writers, and they started questioning the interlinkage between superstition and religion. And most of the writings that were written during this period definitely have a hint of this theme. Then Kuntala Kumari Sabat, the first feminist writer of Uriya literature, she also wrote against superstitions, and the fervor of patriotism was also there in her writings. Then Kamla Chaudhary 1908 had joined the nationalist movement, and she also wrote about emergence of nation as a modern nation, emergence of India and Indian women as a modern nation who would get rid of superstitious beliefs and practices. Then a number of other magazines and journals that one must mention, even though in passing reference, are Sri Dharma. Sri Dharma was a magazine that was edited by Annie Besant and her organization called Women Indian Association. It invited the women to participate in the national struggle. So it kind of mobilized women, asked them to come out of their homes and participate in what was the most important development taking place in India. A very important initiative in this was taken by Arya Mahila. It was a journal that had been edited by Sanatan Dharma Mahamandal. It looked at the status of women on the basis of Vedic knowledge. Then Madhuri and Saraswati, they were also important journals which were published in Hindi, and they also published a series of articles about the lifestyle of women abroad. By writing these kind of articles, they were exposing Indian women to what they were probably missing in their lives, the freedom of speech, thought and action. Then Stri Darpan published a series of articles about the attitude of the husbands towards their wives and the importance of widow remarriage in the lives of women and Indian families. Now, this magazine, interestingly, also advertised for various jobs for women, particularly teaching jobs, because teaching job was considered as a permissible kind of a job that women could go in for. Coming to the aspect of regional languages and how there was development of literature and magazines and journals in regional languages. Here I would be briefly talking about various languages and some important journals or magazines that appeared in these languages. So, for example, in Hindi, the Hindi writings, one can talk about women magazines like Stri Darpan, Maryada, Saraswati, which also included the photographs of schools to inspire other women to come and join these schools, because schooling for women had still not taken off in a big way. Then Maryada, which was a Hindi women magazine, published the articles for women's suffrage movement. That is, that women should also have a right to vote, and they should also have an important role to play in the political changes that were going to come about in India. Now, all these new kind of writings that were emerging were also questioning the traditional roles and models that had been developed for Indian women, that is Sita and Savitri. So they started questioning as to why Indian role models should be limited only to these women, and what was the relevance of these ideals on contemporary women movement. As has been pointed out by Sonal Shukla in 1991, Istri Bodh, though it contained a series of articles on various subjects like fiction, biography, geography, then science, history, travelogues, poems, etc., and some Garba songs also to make the magazine interesting. But sadly, this magazine did not publish any articles on any of the struggles for reforms that were taking place at that time. So this shows that how even many of these women magazines and journals had a lopsided development, and they were not truly radical or revolutionary in complete sense of the term, and they continued to project issues that would make their magazines more socially acceptable and more interesting. So they would regularly publish articles on sewing, embroidery, sketching and drawing, and conveniently forgetting some very important, some very radical issues that were at hand. According to Maithili Srinivas, who has written in detail about various Tamil magazines and literature. So Maithili has pointed out that how women magazines have not included women from all classes. So these magazines definitely had an elitist flavor, and most of these magazines, in fact all of these magazines were edited by women from the urban areas. So most of the women magazines and journals which were edited in both English and Tamil languages, they focused on the issues of educated class women and not the mass base of Indian women, who most of them lived in the rural areas. So while these magazines, they opposed the evils like dowry and early marriages, and they supported the education for girls, and they argued for widow remarriages, they did not raise the issues that were particularly related to the lives of poor women or to related to the lives of women living in the rural areas. Now coming to Kerala and the issue of women's writings, Ilayadam, writing in 2007, has discussed as to how the social reform movements of Kerala reinforced the notion of an ideal wife. And this notion was also repeatedly being projected in a number of articles and magazines that were appearing. For example, various magazines like Sarada, Mahila, Muslim, Mahila Srimati, etc., which were in circulation in Kerala, they projected this theme of an ideal wife or an ideal woman, a well-trained, a well-cultured wife. So by 1930s and 1940s, when the left movements started with full swing in Kerala, and the second phase of Renaissance started in Kerala, there was a strengthening of anti-caste Renaissance and anti-caste movement, which though was anti-feudal and anti-colonial, and it wanted to overthrow landlordism, but it was not still as radical as far as women issues were concerned. A number of women magazine editors in Kerala, like Ammalu Amma, then Ekavu Amma, T.K. Kalyani, they all debated on various issues related to women in colonial Kerala and regularly published articles related to the subject. Two groups which emerged in Kerala on the issue of women's education took different stands. So while one group demanded separate schools and separate curriculum for girls, particularly that they should be trained in domestic work, home science, tailoring, hygiene, weaving, healthy eating, etc. The other group, which was more radical, it demanded that there should be mixed education with the boys, and higher education also should be open to the girls. So there should not be this dichotomy between the different curriculums between boys and girls. As has been pointed out by Binu Mole, writing in 2007, no call was given in Kerala for the equal representation of women, and a clear distinction continued to exist between the male and the female space. So even for a radical state and a state that was quite inspired by the communist movement, when it came to the women issues, the stand remained more or less the same. Now in Kerala, since there was a progress not only in terms of literacy but also caste identity and communal identity, this also impacted women's lives. In 1930s and 1940s, the directions of women's organizations changed from the community to the collectivity. And so this transition from community to collectivity can be seen in the change in the nomenclature also. So now we have a number of women's associations which were not named by any regional name but as Ladies Association Thiruvananthapuram or Sanstha Kerala Mahila Samajyam, etc. A very interesting reference to women and writings has been made by Gail Minault, who has closely observed women's writings in Urdu. In 1888, Gail Minault, in an article titled Urdu Women's Magazines in the early 20th century, in this Minault pointed out that how the women magazines published during pre-independent India created a space for women and made their voices heard. A number of Urdu journals like Tehzeeb-ul-Niswan, which were edited by Niswan Sayyid Mumtaz Ali and his wife Muhammadi Begum, and Ismat, another journal which was edited by Rashiduddin Khairi, they supported the cause of female education and wrote against the polygamy and divorces. Then another very important journal that I have just mentioned, that is Tehzeeb. It published articles which encouraged nationalism and urged women to boycott foreign goods. According to Gail Minault, in Ismat, there was a debate in the favor of women's rights in Islamic community, whereas another journal, Khatun, which was published by the husband-wife team of Sheikh Abdullah and Wahid Jahan Begum, it again championed women's cause. As has been pointed out by Rekha Pandey, the Urdu magazines that were published and edited by the Muslim aristocratic class addressed to that class. So Rekha Pandey says that most of these journals and writings that were appearing in Urdu, they were again not being written by anyone else but the upper caste, upper class Muslim women, and 1880s onwards, Muallim-e-Niswan, it became a pioneering journal in Urdu for women in Hyderabad. This again had a lot of backing of royalty. Mohebbe Hussain and his magazine, it started a controversial debate on Parda, but at least a beginning had been made. Then another very interesting magazine was Anisa. Anisa was a magazine that talked in detail about education. It was also a didactic journal that wrote about the Muslim heroines and warriors from the Islamic history, and it talked about how these Muslim heroines had first fulfilled their domestic responsibilities and only then they had ventured out. So the idea was clear that Muslim women had role models in history whom they could emulate. But before doing that, it was very important that they finished their household chores diligently, took care of their husbands and children, and only then they ventured out, something that was being done in the past also. Then another important journal, Anisda, it published articles on childcare, health, hygiene, home management, novels, poetry, biographies, but conveniently neglected a number of social issues that were important. Now, coming to Madras and the writings that developed here, V. Ramakrishna, who has made a detailed study on the region, writing in 1991, Ramakrishna points out that how the colonial Telugu journals were published as a part of the socio-religious reform movements that had started in Andhra. Vrittantani was the first known Telugu journal that was published from Madras as early as 1838. And some other important journals in colonial Andhra were Hitavadi, that came out in 1862, then Indravatani in 1862 again, Sri Vakshi 1863, Tattva Bodhini 1864, etc. Most of these journals again were being written and they were in circulation in the urban areas. They were being patronized by upper class caste urban women, and the outreach was quite limited. Coming to Telugu, Viveka Vardhini criticized social problems such as caste system and published an article which stated that women forcibly confined themselves to their homes, and it was not as if only men were forcing women to be at home. So therefore, women who took better care of themselves would definitely be able to venture out, be more confident, and would also become successful both in the home as well as in the public sphere. Telugu Zenana was another magazine which talked about enlightenment, women's emancipation, and female education. Hindu Sundari was another Telugu magazine. In fact, it was the first Telugu magazine which was edited by a woman herself named Mosalakanti Ramabai. Savitri, a very important magazine, was edited by a woman activist called Pulu Gurtha, who encouraged women writers to publish their works and repeatedly talked about various evil practices that had continued to pervade the society. From 1883 to 1919, this was a very crucial phase for women's journalism in Telugu. A number of new journals developed that were edited by both men as well as women, like Andhra Lakshmi 1921, Hindu Yuvathi 1923, Bharat Mahila 1925, Griha Lakshmi 1927, etc. And most of these publications continued till 1947 and even after that. A very important role in this entire process of publishing was also played by the Christian missionaries, because as a result of various activities of Christian missionaries, English education had reached South India, and a number of women journals like Vivekavati and Intimations to Women had started appearing in Madras and Guntur, and they also encouraged proselytization activities besides the emancipation of women. Then the journal Istri Dharma and Saundarya Vattili. It was edited by Ramabai, and this also contained a series of articles not only on nationalism but also on various issues related to problems being faced by women in their families. As has been pointed out by V. Ramakrishna in 1991, there was a difference in the kind of magazines that were being edited by men and by women. So while both men and women had started this noble cause of publishing various articles pertaining to women issues, there was a basic difference in the way magazines were planned and topics were being picked. What was the difference? The difference was that the magazines edited by men were concerned about the moral issues such as chastity, housekeeping, frugality, discipline, while the women edited magazines, they focused on issues like early marriage, condition of widows, need of women teachers, etc. So therefore, women magazines were more focused on those issues that directly or indirectly impacted women's own life cycle. Women editors also considered women as weak and exploited and in need of help. It was men who considered women as weak and exploited and in need of help, whereas women editors and writers, they were kind of projecting a different image of women, trying to show that how gradually women were giving away superstitious beliefs and practices and were taking command of their own lives. Most of the women editors also criticized the contemporary Western women activists. So, for example, when Uma Nehru criticized the reimposition of Sita Savitri ideal on contemporary women in Maryada, which was a Hindi journal, her argument was rejected by the editor of Istri Darpan, which urged that the contemporary women should continue to worship these earlier idols of Savitri and Sita, and there was nothing greater or more benevolent than these ideals. Also, most of these women writers who were writing in Bengal as early as 19th century, they would carefully write about a modern woman, that a modern woman should not be like a Mem Sahib, she should not be like a westernized femininity who carries who is not able to dignify her presence, who is not able to command respect, and at all costs she should avoid being projected as a Mem Sahib. So this image was very important, that image of Indian femininity which had to be rooted in the past, which had to be carried forward by the legacies of great women like Sita and Savitri. That could not have been given up. Then a very interesting observation in this regard has been made by Partha Chatterjee, who says that how the construction of a new woman by the reformers of colonial India was being undertaken. The new woman had to be different from the common woman. She need not be coarse, vulgar, loud, quarrelsome. She had to have moral sense. Her sexuality had to be controlled. She need not be promiscuous. So she could be anything but all of these. So this new image of women was definitely going to rob her of all the little freedom that she had. And a number of apprehensions were also there as far as women's education were concerned, because the nationalist ideology accorded the status of cultural superiority as compared to the westernized women. Now, most of these magazines, as I have already mentioned, had middle and upper class affiliations, and this was a major weakness that was attached to them. Women's writings in pre-independence India definitely marked the early phase of the feminist writing, but these memoirs and autobiographies not only celebrated selfhood and individuality, but they also open a very interesting window to the past. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much for giving us a productive session. And dear friends, do give your feedback for this particular lecture at info.cec@nic.in. The lecture is going to be uploaded soon, and we too will be meeting tomorrow and would be continuing further on our series on women and education, women and history. Till then, take care. Goodbye. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so very much.